When you requested this, Atlanta child murders, honestly, it kind of sent chills down my spine, Reading about it is one thing, but to actually unpack it like this, with you listening, it hits differently.
Yeah, it does. And it's crucial, I think, to acknowledge that weight as we start, right? We're dealing with real lives here, real families forever changed by this.
Absolutely. We'll do our best to honor their stories. And I know you've been digging into the research on this. Late 1970s, early 80s, Atlanta. Set the scene for us. What was it like back then?
Imagine a city right on the verge of change. Atlanta was considered this, black Mecca of the South, a place of opportunity, especially after the Civil Rights Movement. But underneath that, there were these deep societal issues, poverty, racial tensions, a justice system that didn't always treat everyone equally. And these weren't just abstract problems, right? They were woven into the very fabric of life there, affecting everything, how neighborhoods were formed, how law enforcement operated, everything.
And then, into this already complex picture, you introduce this string of disappearances, mostly African-American children, right? What was that like for the families, for that entire community, living with that fear?
Imagine that. The dread just growing as more children vanished. Fear seeping into everything. Parents afraid to even let their kids play outside. The community, already dealing with so much, now united by this shared terror. Each missing child, it was like a punch to the gut. This stark reminder of how vulnerable they were, and how it seemed no one in power really cared.
And we're talking about a significant number of victims here. I think it's important to grasp that scale right away.
It's staggering. From 79 to 81, at least 29 black children and young adults ages 7 to 21 were murdered or just disappeared. Each one a life cut short, a family left with this void.
29. It's heavy. Not a statistic, Can we, maybe to make it more real, talk about some of them by name?
Of course. Edward Smith. He was the first, only 14. His disappearance, January 79, it shook the city, like a crack in the foundation of their sense of safety. Then, that summer, you had Alfred Smith and Milton Harvey, both 14, gone. It wasn't just isolated incidents anymore, this chilling pattern emerging.
And the police, did they see that connection early on, or was there a delay in realizing what was happening?
Sadly, the initial response from the Atlanta PD was slow, and some argue inadequate. A lot of people in the African-American community, they felt like their fears weren't being taken seriously, that their children's lives didn't matter, and that just fueled more anger, more distrust.
I can only imagine. To feel like the very people who are supposed to protect you are turning away, it's awful. But the community, they didn't just wait around, did they? What gets me is their strength, their resilience in the face of this.
No, they didn't. They saw a system failing them, and they took action. Organized patrols themselves, parents walking their kids to and from school, everyone on high alert, looking out for one another.
That's incredible, to have that strength when it would have been so easy to give in to the fear. But did the investigation ever, did it ever really gain any traction? Was there a turning point?
Yeah, there was. And it centers around a name you've probably heard before, Wayne Williams.
Okay, so Wayne Williams. Tell us about him. How does he fit into all of this?
It actually didn't start with the child murders. It was May of '81. Police were watching the Chattahoochee River bridges, thought there might be a connection to the cases, and they saw Williams's car near where they found Nathaniel Cater's body. He was 27. They brought Williams in for questioning.
So not a child, but an adult. Was there anything that immediately linked him to the other disappearances, the murders?
That's where it gets complicated. See, they cleared him initially, but then 2 weeks later, they found Jimmy Ray Payne's body, 21 years old, same river. That's when they really focused on Williams.
And this is where, in the research, it gets really interesting. Controversial even, the evidence they had on Williams.
Yeah. The prosecution, they built their case around this pattern they saw in the killings, and they had some witness statements saying they'd seen Williams near where some of the victims were last seen. But the big thing was fiber evidence.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't, forensic scientists, what's the deal with this fiber evidence?
So they found fibers on some of the victims, and they matched fibers from Williams's house, his car, even his dog. It was circumstantial, meaning it didn't directly prove he did it, but it created a link.
I mean, that sounds pretty damning, being able to connect those fibers back to him. But I remember reading something about fiber analysis back then, how reliable it was. What's a deeper dive on that?
Good point. Fiber analysis wasn't nearly as advanced back then. Today we know it can be helpful, but it's not as definitive as, say, DNA. And that's been a huge debate in this case ever since.
So we've got these fibers, the supposed patterns, some witness statements. Was it enough? What happened at the trial?
Williams was convicted. But here's the thing. For the murders of Cater and Payne, those 2 adults, 2 life sentences. But he was never actually tried for any of the child murders.
Wait, he was convicted of 2 murders, but never even tried for the 29 children at the heart of this whole thing. I don't even know what to say to that.
And that right there is what's caused so much debate, so much frustration, especially for the families. The prosecution, they said the similarities in the cases were enough, even without direct evidence. Case closed, according to them. But for a lot of people, it wasn't nearly enough.
So that's it. Wayne Williams is convicted, but not for the crimes that really sparked this whole thing. Atlanta's left with this case officially closed, but with so much still hanging in the air, I can't imagine those families, the families of the children, just accepting that.
They didn't, and that's really important to remember. For them, that fight for justice, for acknowledgement, for some kind of closure, it never went away. And the impact on Atlanta, on the city as a whole, it went way beyond just the courts and the trials, a collective trauma, you know? It ran deep.
It's that saying, right? Justice delayed is justice denied. But even beyond the families themselves, how did it change Atlanta?
It shattered this, well, I guess you'd call it an illusion of safety, especially for Black families. It showed how real, how dangerous these underlying issues were.
Yeah.
Racial bias, poverty, they weren't just talking points, they had actual tragic consequences.
And we're talking about a time when those issues weren't as openly talked about as they are now. Did this case, in a way, force people to confront them?
Without a doubt. The Atlanta child murders, they sparked a national conversation about race, poverty, justice. People who'd never really had to think about these things before, they were forced to look at them. It was a wake-up call.
And beyond the societal shifts, were there actual changes made in law enforcement specifically because of all this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was a huge outcry about how the investigation was handled at first. And that pressure, the need to do better, especially for missing children, especially in marginalized communities. It led to some big reforms. The way they investigated missing persons cases, it was completely revamped. More focus on the community, on communication.
It's a shame it takes something so horrible to make that happen. But you're right, it did lead to change. It's never just about policy, though, is it? These children, this case, they haven't been forgotten. How has this story lived on in our culture and how we remember this time?
That's the thing about stories, isn't it? The Atlanta child murders, they still resonate with people all these years later. Books like The List by Tyree Jones or that documentary, Atlanta's Missing and Murdered, those are just a couple. They all try to grapple with what happened to make sure these victims aren't just a statistic. They give a voice to the families, to that community, and keep those questions of justice alive.
Because even when a case is closed, the search for truth, for understanding, it doesn't just stop. And what we've done here, if anything, it shows how complicated, how heartbreaking that search can be.
It does. We analyze the evidence, the theories, but it's that human element, right? The grief, the loss, that fight for justice. That's what stays with you. It challenges us to think about our own society then and now, to keep asking the tough questions even when we don't want to hear the answers.
We've only just scratched the surface, but I think we've given you, the listener, a lot to think about. If this case has really gotten under your skin the way it has ours, take a look at the research we linked. There's so much more to uncover.
I agree. And that's what's so important about a deep dive like this. It's not about having all the answers. It's about thinking harder, digging deeper, about honoring those we lost, and recognizing how this tragedy still affects us.
This one will stay with me, no doubt. And I have a feeling you might be doing some digging of your own after this. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.